The wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke and fresh bread across the lonely stretch of prairie, curling into the weathered walls of the ranch house like an uninvited guest. It was the kind of morning when silence said more than words. When the ticking of the old clock above the stove felt louder than the shuffle of boots on the porch. Out here, life was built on hard work, long days, and the unspoken weight of loss that lingered in a home where laughter used to live. She stood by the kitchen window, hands folded tight against her apron, watching the sun climb above the horizon. Her heart still beat heavy from the long night, the cries of her newborn filling every corner of the cabin until exhaustion had wrapped her bones like chains. She was a widow, now too young to carry such a title, yet too weathered by grief to deny it. The baby was all she had left of a man who had promised forever and given her only a handful of years. And though the neighbors came by when they could, offering casseroles and kind words, she knew most days would be faced alone. That was until the ranch cook stepped into her life. Most folks only knew him as the man who chopped wood before dawn, stirred stew in the big iron pot, and worked harder than men half his age. He wasn't the kind who spoke much. His voice, when it came, was gravel over stone, slow and measured like the rhythm of the land itself. To the ranch hands, he was steady as the cast-iron skillet that never left his side, a man meant for the background of long suppers and early breakfasts. But to her, there was something more. She had seen it in the way he lingered at the door when she struggled with her child, in the way his eyes softened when the baby wailed, and in the quiet respect he carried whenever he tipped his hat. It was a small thing. Yet it mattered in a world where small things often made the difference between surviving and breaking. On that morning, the baby's cries rang out again, high and sharp. She pressed her palms against her tired face, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone was listening to. That was when the door creaked, and the cook stepped in. His shoulders filled the frame, dust clinging to his shirt from the morning chores. But his hands were steady as he reached out without a word. For a moment, she hesitated, clutching the child close. What right had she to lean on another when she was supposed to be strong? Yet her arms trembled, her resolve cracked, and she placed the swaddled bundle into his waiting grasp. He held the baby as if he had done it all his life. Rough hands, scarred from years of work, cradled the child with a gentleness that seemed out of place in a man like him. His thumb brushed the blanket, steadying the newborn's fussing, until the cries softened to a whimper. The woman's breath caught in her throat as she watched, the sight unraveling something inside her she had kept tied too tightly. She had thought of him as just a hired hand, someone who kept the fires burning and the pots full. But in that moment, standing in the dim light of her kitchen, she saw more. There was strength in his arms, but there was also something deeper, a patience, a kind of quiet understanding that didn't need words. The baby blinked up at him, small fists opening and closing as if testing the weight of the world. And for the first time since the funeral, she felt the heavy grip of loneliness loosen just a little. She clasped her hands against her lips, afraid that if she spoke, her voice would betray the ache in her chest. He looked at her then, his eyes steady, saying nothing. Maybe he knew words weren't needed. Maybe he understood that sometimes silence carried more comfort than any promise could. Still, storm brewed beneath her calm. What did it mean to see him this way? To feel the edges of her heart stir when she wasn't ready for it. To notice that he, of all people, might be more than she ever allowed herself to imagine. The baby cooed softly in his arms. She realized she couldn't look away. The ranch life was unforgiving, and so was grief. She had no room for weakness, no space for anything beyond survival. Yet as the cook stood there, rocking her child with a tenderness that felt both foreign and familiar, she wondered if fate had given her a glimpse of something she wasn't supposed to see yet. The morning light shifted, spilling across the wooden floor, painting them both in its glow. Her heart beat faster. She wanted to ask him how he could hold a child like that, as if he carried both strength and sorrow in equal measure. She wanted to ask what stories his silence hid, what pains or promises had shaped the man before her, but the words never left her lips. Instead, she watched him torn between fear and hope, knowing the days ahead would demand choices she wasn't ready to make. Choices about trust, about love, about whether a widow could open her heart again to someone she barely knew. And as the baby's breathing grew even in his arms, the truth pressed in on her with quiet force. This cook was not just a man hired to tend fires and meals. He was something more. Yet what that meant, or where it would lead, she could not yet say. The kettle whistled on the stove, breaking the spell. She turned, blinking back the questions that swarmed her mind, and busied her hands, though her heart would not settle. Behind her, the cook shifted the child gently, as though he had no intention of letting go any time soon. And in that fragile, fleeting moment, one thought clung to her like a shadow. Maybe the future she feared was already stepping quietly into her life, one heartbeat at a time. But then came the sound of boots on the porch, heavy, deliberate, and unfamiliar. Her chest tightened as she froze in place, knowing that whatever was about to happen would change everything. The sound of boots on the porch grew heavier, each step pressing against the wood as though carrying weight beyond its measure. She held her breath, her hands tightening around the edge of the counter. Out here, visitors were rare unless they brought news or trouble. The baby stirred faintly in the cook's arms, and the man's steady hand quieted the child with a soft, rhythmic motion, though his gaze flicked toward the door. His jaw tightened. The kind of instinct that came from a life lived always expecting something to go wrong. When the door pushed open, it brought with it a gust of morning air and the figure of a man wrapped in trail dust. His hat was pulled low, his shoulders square, and though his face was shadowed, there was a certain sharpness in the way he stood. He carried himself not like a passerby, but like someone who knew the land, someone who expected to be noticed. The widow swallowed, her heart stumbling against her ribs. She could not place him, yet something about his presence unsettled her. The cook shifted slightly, adjusting his hold on the baby, as if instinctively placing himself between the child and the stranger. No words passed at first, only the scrape of boots against the wooden floor and the faint hiss of the kettle on the stove. The widow finally found her voice, though it came out thin. She asked if she could help him, her tone polite but edged with caution. The stranger lifted his head then, revealing eyes that carried a flicker of familiarity, though she couldn't tell if it was memory or imagination that made her chest tighten. He said he was passing through, looking for work, maybe a place to rest. His voice carried the road in it, dusty, tired, yet sharp enough to suggest there was more beneath the surface. The cook did not speak, but the silence he cast into the room was heavier than words. He rocked the baby gently, steady as a stone, but his eyes never left the man at the door. The widow hesitated, torn between hospitality and the uneasy pull of instinct. Life on the prairie demanded generosity. One never knew when a kind act might be returned in time of need, but it also demanded caution. Strangers could carry more than dust on their boots. She offered him coffee, her voice steadier this time, though her hands trembled as she poured. The man thanked her, stepping further inside, and the room felt suddenly smaller. The baby let out a soft sigh in the cook's arms, and the sound seemed to tether her back to the present. She looked at the child, then at the man who held him, and felt a strange sense of safety even in the midst of uncertainty, as the stranger drank. His eyes swept the room, the stove, the shelves lined with jars, the worn table that had seen better days. He asked gentle questions at first, about the ranch, about the land, about whether help was needed. But beneath the politeness was something probing, something that made the widow shift uncomfortably. She answered sparingly, her mind working quickly to measure his intent. The cook remained silent, but the strength of his presence filled the gaps. It wasn't hostility he carried, it was protection. He stood like a wall, unyielding, as though daring the stranger to step too close. The widow noticed it then, how the cook's quiet strength was more than muscle, more than habit. It was something rooted deep, a loyalty that asked for nothing but gave everything when it was needed most. She thought back to the years before, when her husband was still alive. The ranch had been loud with laughter then, with the sound of horses and the clatter of boots returning late after long rides. She remembered the way he would toss his hat onto the table and scoop her up with ease, the way his voice filled every corner of the cabin. Now all of that was gone, and the silence had taken root so deeply that she wondered if she would ever hear laughter again. The baby was the only spark left of that old life, and she carried him as if her very breath depended on it. Her husband had trusted the cook before she did, said he was the kind of man who needed no praise, the kind who worked because work was its own reward. When others laughed around the fire, the cook had sat back, watchful, always a little apart. She used to think he was distant, hard to know, but now she wondered if she had mistaken caution for coldness. Perhaps he had always been guarding something deeper than anyone realized. The stranger finished his coffee, setting the cup down with a dull clink. He thanked her again, but his eyes lingered too long, not on her, but on the child nestled against the cook's chest. A flicker of something recognition, maybe even longing, passed through his expression before he masked it with a half-smile. The widow caught it, though, and her stomach tightened with unease. He left after a moment, stepping back onto the porch, promising he might return if work was needed. The door closed behind him, and only then did she realize she had been holding her breath. The cook's eyes stayed on the door a moment longer before he looked down at the baby, his thumb brushing the blanket again, steady as ever. She wanted to ask what he thought. If he had seen the same flicker she had, if the unease that prickled her skin was justified. But when she looked at him, she found herself unable to speak. His expression was unreadable, yet in his silence, she sensed he had noticed everything and more. The baby stirred, and the widow reached out, her fingers brushing against the cook's as he handed the child back. The touch lingered, just enough to make her breath catch before she pulled away. She told herself it was nothing, that she was simply tired, that her heart was too raw to trust its own beat. Still, as she held her child close, she could not shake the way his gentleness had settled into her bones. The day wore on, but the unease remained. She moved through her chores with a kind of distracted rhythm, always glancing toward the horizon as though expecting the stranger to return. The cook went about his work too, though she noticed him more often near the house than usual, his shadow steady at the edge of her days. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. As night drew near, the prairie stretched quiet beneath a sky dusted with stars. The baby slept at last, and she sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The cook passed behind her, his footsteps soft, carrying the smell of smoke and bread. For a moment, the cabin felt almost like home again, as though warmth could return to a place carved hollow by grief. Yet even in that warmth, the memory of the stranger's eyes burned like a warning she could not ignore. She wondered who he was, what brought him to her door, and why the baby seemed to draw his gaze so strongly. She wondered what the cook thought of it all, and if he carried answers behind the silence he wore like armor. The questions pressed against her chest, but she swallowed them down, knowing the prairie had its way of revealing truth slowly, in its own time. And so she sat in the glow of the fire, her child breathing softly in the cradle beside her, the cook's shadow steady in the corner of the room. Outside, the night stretched wide and restless, holding secrets she wasn't yet ready to face. But in her heart she knew the peace of that evening could not last. Something was coming, carried on the sound of boots and the weight of silence. And when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. The night after the stranger's visit did not bring rest. Sleep came in fits, broken by the baby's cries and the echo of boot steps on the porch that she could not push from her mind. Each creak of the house seemed louder, each gust of wind scraping against the shutters, sounding like a hand testing the window latch. She lay awake, staring at the rafters, the baby pressed against her chest, listening to the steady rhythm of the cook pacing the floor near the door. He did not say he was keeping watch, but she knew that was what he was doing. When morning came, she found herself studying him differently. He was at the stove before dawn, stirring the pot with that same unhurried rhythm he always carried, yet there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He moved like a man waiting for something, his silence sharper than usual. She wanted to ask him what he thought about the stranger, whether he believed the man's story about looking for work, but her words caught in her throat. The ranch hands drifted in for breakfast, filling the table with laughter and loud talk. Unaware of the unease threading through her chest, they spoke of fences that needed mending, of cattle gone missing near the river, of the storm clouds gathering in the west. It was the same talk as always, yet she could not shake the feeling that change was pressing in from all sides. The cook kept his head down, serving plates, listening but not speaking. When his eyes met hers for a moment, she felt that he was carrying more than he let on. Later, when the hands were gone, she carried the baby out to the yard for fresh air. The prairie stretched wide, endless grass rolling toward the horizon. But what had once felt like freedom now felt like exposure. She searched the distance for any sign of movement, for the silhouette of a man on horseback, and found none. Still, her heart would not settle. The cook came out after a while, wiping his hands on a rag. He stood beside her, gazing out at the land with the same quiet watchfulness. He didn't ask what she was looking for. Instead, he shifted his stance, as though to remind her she wasn't alone. She wanted to thank him, to tell him that his presence mattered more than he knew. But the words stuck, caught between grief and fear. By mid-afternoon, the baby was restless again, his small cries carrying through the cabin walls. As she rocked him, her thoughts turned to the past. Her husband had been strong but not invincible. He had gone out one morning, chasing down a stray calf, and never returned. The accident had been quick, they said, a fall on rocky ground. She had buried him with the neighbors standing by, their hats in hand, but when the dust settled and the mourners left, she had been alone with a baby on the way, and a silence too large to fill. The cook had been there too, standing at a distance, his face unreadable. She had thought then that he was only doing his duty, only showing the kind of respect a worker owed to his employer's family. But now, watching him with her child, she wondered if it had been more than duty all along. As the day wore on, riders came from the ranch with news that cattle had been found dead near the creek, their hides cut and meat taken. Rustlers were moving closer, bold enough to strike near their land. The men cursed, talking of patrols and stronger fences. But in her heart, she wondered if the stranger from yesterday had known more than he said. His eyes had lingered too long on her baby, too long on the cabin itself, as if measuring what could be taken. That night, unease settled heavier. She lit the lamp and sat near the cradle, her sewing untouched in her lap. The cook was outside tending the firewood, his shadow stretching across the yard. She listened for every sound, every rustle in the grass, every shift of the wind. When at last he stepped inside, the smell of smoke clinging to him, she felt herself breathe easier without meaning to. He looked at her then, the lamp catching in his eyes, and for a heartbeat she thought he might speak. But he didn't. He only nodded, as if to say he understood, and sat in the chair near the door. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything neither dared to say. The days that followed carried the same tension. The stranger did not return, but the threat of him lingered like a shadow at the edge of the prairie. The ranch hands spoke often of rustlers, their voices low and serious. She caught bits of talk about missing horses, about tracks leading toward the foothills, about men seen camped near the river who did not belong there. Each word tightened the knot in her chest. One evening, she overheard two hands whispering near the barn, saying they thought the widow's land was being watched, that someone had reason to keep an eye on her cabin. She pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from crying out, the baby stirring in her arms. When she turned, she saw the cook standing nearby, his face in shadow, listening. His jaw tightened, but still he said nothing. That night, he stayed near the door again, his chair angled toward the window. She could not sleep, her mind racing with questions. Who was the stranger? Why had he looked at her child like that? And what secrets did the cook carry in his silence? She felt torn between fear of the danger pressing closer and the strange comfort of knowing the cook would not let it reach her. Easily, as the baby drifted back to sleep, she found herself wondering about the man who now guarded her home, who had taught him to cradle a child with such care. What past had shaped him into a man both so strong and so quiet? She realized she knew so little of him, yet trusted him more than she could explain. That trust scared her almost as much as the danger outside. The prairie was never still for long. Trouble had a way of finding those least ready for it. And as she sat there, staring at the firelight flickering against the walls, She knew the stranger would return, and with him, the truth she wasn't sure she wanted to face. But when it came, she would not be alone. The cook's presence, silent and steady, was both her comfort and her question. And though she did not know what lay ahead, she felt the stirrings of something she had thought lost forever, fragile hope. Trembling in the shadow of fear, the night pressed on, carrying secrets in its silence. And the conflict building around her home was only beginning. Would you like me to continue into the next section, where the stranger reappears and his connection to the widow's past is revealed slowly, while the cook's hidden loyalties start to complicate everything further? The days stretched long, each one carrying the weight of a storm building on the horizon. Though the stranger had not returned, his shadow clung to the ranch like a stain that could not be washed away. The widow felt it in every quiet moment, in the silence after the baby's cries settled, in the way the cook's eyes swept the land as if expecting trouble. The ranch hands spoke more openly now of rustlers and missing stock, their voices carrying unease they tried to mask with laughter, but she heard it anyway. One evening, word came from a neighboring homestead that horses had been stolen in the night. Fences were cut, dogs silenced, and the thieves had moved swiftly, without leaving more than a trail of trampled grass. The men cursed the boldness of it, some swearing they would ride out at first light to hunt the culprits. Yet beneath their anger was fear, for they knew these men were no simple drifters. Whoever was behind the thefts was organized, clever, and daring enough to move closer to settled land. The widow kept her worries to herself, though her hands shook as she tucked her baby into the cradle that night. She could not stop thinking of the stranger's eyes, the way they had lingered on her child. Was he connected to the rustlers? Was he scouting her land that day, measuring what could be taken? The questions gnawed at her, pulling sleep further from reach. The cook's silence grew heavier, though she noticed his watchfulness never faltered. He kept himself near the cabin more often, his steps quiet but steady, his gaze always sweeping the distance. He spoke little, but his presence was a wall between her and the unease pressing in. Sometimes, when the firelight flickered across his face, she thought she saw something in his expressions, something like memory, as though he knew more of this danger than he let on. One afternoon, when the baby finally slept and the cabin was still, she found the courage to ask him. She asked if he believed the stranger would return, her voice trembling more than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment before answering, his words slow and measured. He said men like that didn't just pass through. If he had come once, he would come again. The certainty in his tone chilled her, even as it made her trust him more. Days later, the stranger did return. It was late in the afternoon when she saw him riding across the field, his horse moving at an easy pace, his posture calm, as though he belonged there. Her chest tightened as she gathered her child close, watching through the window as the cook stepped out onto the porch. The two men faced each other in the fading light, the silence between them sharp as a blade. The stranger dismounted slowly, tipping his hat in a show of politeness, though his eyes held no warmth. He said he was looking for honest work again, that he had heard rustlers were near and thought perhaps his gun might be of use. But his words rang too smooth, too practiced. The cook did not move, did not speak. His stance was steady, his eyes fixed on the man before him. Carrying a warning without a word, the widow stepped out then, her baby in her arms, her heart hammering against her ribs. The stranger's eyes flickered to the child, and for a moment his smile faltered. She caught it just as she had before, and her unease deepened. She told him firmly that they had all the help they needed, her voice steadier than she felt. He only nodded, his smile returning, though it did not reach his eyes. He tipped his hat again, mounted, and rode away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. That night, the cook stayed by the door long after the lamps were blown out. She could hear the weight of his breathing in the dark, steady and strong, like the earth itself refusing to move. She lay awake too, staring into the blackness, the baby warm against her chest. The questions in her mind grew louder with each passing hour. Who was the stranger? Why did he look at her child like that? And why did she feel as though the cook knew more than he was telling her? The days that followed pulled tighter, each one thick with unease. The ranch hands grew restless, riding further each day to check fences and scout the land. Rumors spread of more thefts, more signs of strangers moving under the cover of night. She heard whispers that some believed an insider was feeding the rustlers information. Someone who knew which ranches were weak, which families were alone. The thought chilled her, for it meant that danger was not only outside but possibly closer than she imagined. The cook remained her anchor, though even he could not hide the tension in his stance. She caught him sharpening his knife by the fire one evening, the blade glinting in the lamplight. He worked with steady hands, his expression calm, but the sight unsettled her. She wanted to ask if he was preparing for something, if he knew what lay ahead, but she could not bring herself to. Instead, she rocked her baby gently. Humming to quiet the storm inside her chest, the stranger came again, at dusk, a week later. This time with 2 other men riding at his side. They stopped at the edge of the field, watching the cabin without moving closer. The widow stood at the window, her breath caught, as the cook stepped out onto the porch once more. The air was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against the skin and made every sound sharper. The men did not speak, not at first. They only sat their horses, their eyes fixed on the cabin, on the woman and child inside. Then the stranger called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. He said they meant no harm, only that they sought fair trade and honest shelter. But the edge in his tone told another story. The cook did not answer, his hand resting lightly on the rail of the porch, its presence unyielding. The widow clutched her child, her heart racing. She felt the tension build like a rope pulled too tight, ready to snap. She knew then that the storm was no longer distant. It was here, standing at the edge of her land, staring straight into her life. The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry, and the sound seemed to cut through the air like a blade. The stranger's eyes narrowed at the noise, his smile fading once more. And in that instant, she understood something she had not dared to admit before. The conflict was not just about cattle or land. It was about her child. Her knees weakened beneath her as she held the baby close, the truth pressing hard against her chest. She turned toward the cook, his silhouette framed against the fading light, and saw in him the only shield she had left. The stranger's men shifted in their saddles, the tension climbing higher, the air trembling with unspoken threat. The prairie held its breath, the world narrowing to that single moment. The cabin, the porch, the riders waiting at the edge. The widow's heart pounded, her child's small weight in her arms, both her strength and her fear. And as the last of the daylight bled away, she knew the next move would decide everything. The sun dipped below the prairie edge, painting the sky in streaks of fire before surrendering to the deep blue of night. The riders waited at the far edge of the field, shadows on horseback, their presence pressing down on the small cabin like a storm cloud too heavy to hold itself. The widow clutched her baby against her chest, her pulse thundering louder than the child's soft whimpers. She had never felt the world so fragile, as if the land itself held its breath. The cook stood firm on the porch, broad-shouldered and silent, his stance as immovable as an oak. He didn't raise his voice, didn't posture like the men across from him, yet in that quiet strength was something more commanding than any threat. The stranger finally urged his horse a few steps closer, the faint sound of hooves sinking into dry earth breaking the silence. His eyes swept over the cabin, pausing on the glow of lamplight in the window, then on the child nestled in her arms. He spoke again, saying the plains were hard, that men had to take what they needed to survive. His words were coated in politeness, but the sharpness underneath was plain. He asked her no, demanded with a smile too thin to be true, why she would cling so fiercely to a life so small. A child who could not fend for himself. He hinted at debts, at ties she didn't understand. And for a chilling moment, she realized the stranger was not speaking to her at all, but to the cook. Her breath caught. The pieces slid together in her mind, sharp and unwelcome. The cook's watchfulness, his silence, his steady hand that never left the door. He had known this man. Maybe he had once ridden with him, maybe once shared the same campfire smoke and divided spoils under the cover of night. She felt the floor tilt beneath her, torn between fear and the strange. stubborn trust she had placed in the man now standing between her and danger. The cook finally spoke, his voice low but firm, carrying across the open space with the weight of truth. He said he had left that life behind. He said he had seen enough of the wrong side of the law to know it ended only one way: blood. In broken families, in graves too shallow for the men who dug them. He told the stranger that the child was not his to threaten, nor the woman his to disturb. His words were simple, but they carried a finality that made even the riders shift uneasily in their saddles. The stranger's smile faded. He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes hardening. He told the cook that no man walked away clean, that debts had long shadows, and that he had come to collect what was owed. For the first time, the cook's shoulders stiffened, and the widow's heart sank. She realized then the truth she had feared: the stranger had come for him. And somehow, the baby had become part of it. The tension snapped like a whip. One of the riders shifted, his hand brushing his belt, but the cook moved quicker than she had ever seen. His voice cut through the dark, sharp as a blade, warning them off with a tone that brooked no argument. He said if they wanted him, they would have to come through him here and now. His stance made it clear he had nothing left to fear, nothing left to lose. The widow's throat tightened, fear and hope colliding. She wanted to cry out, to beg them to leave, to plead with the cook not to sacrifice himself for her. But she held her child tighter, knowing this was his choice. One he had already made long before tonight. The standoff stretched into eternity. Then, as if sensing the resolve in him, the stranger finally pulled his reins. His horse backed away, hooves kicking up dust. He said this wasn't finished, that the past never truly stayed buried, but his words were weaker now, his men uneasy. Without another glance, they turned their horses and rode off into the dark. Their silhouettes swallowed by the prairie night. The silence left behind was heavier than gunfire. The widow sank into the nearest chair, her arms trembling around her child. The cook stepped inside, closing the door behind him, his face unreadable in the lamplight. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the baby's small, steady breathing. At last she found her voice, though it shook as she asked him if what the stranger said was true. He didn't deny it. He told her he had once lived by a different code, that he had followed men like that across the plains, thinking there was freedom in lawlessness. But he had walked away when he saw what it cost: families shattered, children left fatherless, women standing alone in doorways with nothing but dust and grief. He said he could never undo what had been done, but he could choose a different road now. Tears stung her eyes, not from fear but from the weight of his honesty. She realized then that the man who stood before her was not just a cook, not just a hired hand. He was someone who had clawed his way out of the darkness and chosen to stand in the light, even when it meant facing the ghosts that came back for him. The days that followed were quiet, though the unease never fully left. The ranch hands spoke often of the rustlers, but the strangers did not return. Perhaps they had found easier prey, or perhaps they knew the cook's resolve was not worth testing again. The widow carried on with her work, her baby growing stronger each day, and the cook remained steady at her side, his presence a shield she no longer questioned. In the stillness of one evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she sat on the porch with her child in her arms. The cook stood nearby, mending a bridle, the rhythm of his hands sure and unhurried. She watched him for a long moment, then told him softly that he was not defined by what he had been, but by the man he chose to be now. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something: unspoken gratitude, perhaps even hope. Life on the prairie was never easy. There would always be storms, always be the threat of men who took what wasn't theirs. But she knew now that she was not alone in facing them. The cook had proven himself in ways no words could capture. He had taken her child into his arms, not just with gentleness, but with a vow, silent yet unbreakable, as the stars lit the wide sky above them. The widow felt something she had thought lost forever stir in her chest. It wasn't just safety. It wasn't just relief. It was the fragile beginning of trust, of love blooming in the most unlikely soil. She didn't speak it, not yet. But she knew it was there. The prairie wind carried the scent of sage and smoke, and the baby stirred softly, opening his eyes to the vast world ahead. The widow held him close, her heart lighter than it had been in many months. She looked at the cook, steady and silent at her side, and realized that sometimes the people who came into your life quietly were the ones who changed it most. The danger had passed, though its shadow lingered. But in its place was something stronger: resilience, hope, and the promise of a future not built on fear, but on the kind of strength that comes from standing together. The cook lifted his eyes to the horizon, then back to her, and for the first time, she didn't see a hired hand. She saw the man who had chosen to stay, to protect, to be more than anyone expected. And in that moment, under the endless sweep of prairie sky, she knew her story was no longer just about loss. It was about finding something worth holding on to, even in the hardest of places. The night grew calm, the baby drifted back to sleep, and the widow felt peace settle into her bones. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with him by her side. And for the first time since her world had broken apart, she believed the days ahead could hold more than sorrow. They could hold life, laughter, and the quiet kind of love that grows strong in the silence of a prairie night.